Right, we are live onto YouTube. I just want to do a quick introduction. My name is Mariana, and I'm very excited to be here with you all and get to be a part of this lecture. Just want to do a quick intro. The MindWalks program is underwritten by the Thomas E. and Mary Kathryn Eltzroth Fund and supported by the Central Coast State Parks Association. Well, welcome to today's virtual MindWalk on Dialogic Interpretation. We are here with Dr. Jacquie Gilson, and from that, it's all you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here with you. And thanks for those who participated in the menti.com. You've still got time to join in. I was saying earlier that I like to use Menti because it just helps make things participatory, and that's really what I'm all about, is trying to have people participate. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to change the slide, which means if you're following the slides on your phone, they'll change. And some slides you have an opportunity to type things in on Menti, and other slides you don't. So you'll figure it out as we go. Glad to be here. Okay, so I want to welcome you to your Dialogic Interpretation, or DI, sampler. And this is a program I've been doing for the last 6 months or so as an hour-long introduction to just what Dialogic Interpretation is all about. Alrighty. A little bit about me. All right, so there I am at a Denver conference back when we were allowed to go to conferences. So I just want to tell you a bit about me. I've been involved in the interpretation and environmental education field all of my career, always working in parks at all different levels, and always in the interpretation, environmental education side of things. So about 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to do my PhD. So I went to Royal Roads University, which is actually in Victoria, out here on Vancouver Island. And I studied the idea of inspiration in the field of interpretation. And I'll share with you what came out of that as we go along today. But during that time, I was very fortunate to be working for Parks Canada. I worked for them for about 9 years in the mountain parks in a park known as Banff, you may have heard of it, and in the Lake Louise area. Hopefully you've been up there and visited or get a chance to. It's beautiful. So while I was working there, I finished off my doctorate. My boss said, well, hey, let's try to use some of your new ideas with our staff here in our interpretation program. So he gave me that opportunity to try out the ideas, and that was wonderful. A year ago, I did retire from Parks Canada, moved to Vancouver Island, and set up my own company, and that's my little company symbol there. So I call it Interp Active, and you'll find out why it's got a flower symbol there in a minute, but I do like to think that Interp needs to be active, and therefore the name of my company. So a little bit about me. I do also like to share with people a bit about my philosophy, I guess, where I'm coming from, and this has been developing over the years. The diagram on the left is really a summary of what came out of my research into inspiration. The key point is, I believe, that in interpretation, we should be inspiring people. And for starters, that means that central point there where the star is, the idea that people have different entry points to inspiration. People can be inspired through head, of course, through information, through the heart, through emotional experiences, and through the hands, so being participatory. But the other side, I guess, of inspiration that I studied and enjoy sharing with people is this idea that inspiration breaks down into two sides. What people are inspired by, and you see that as the green part of the swirl, and what people are inspired to. And that if you don't have both sides, you're not really talking inspiration. And so I try to work on inspiring people by certain things and inspiring to certain things. And I do have my book out now called Inspired to Inspire. The Amazon.ca there is actually for my Canadian audiences, so you would just change it to Amazon.com. It's there. So I hope you'll be interested in having a look at it. So just so you know then where I'm coming from when I talk about dialogic interpretation is I'm coming from this perspective of we're all about inspiring people, and people are inspired through participation, including something like dialogue. And so hands-on participation and talking about it. And then I also firmly believe that interpretation, we need to be about inspiring people to action. So that call to action idea, and that fits very nicely with dialogic interpretation as well. Okay, so here's how I'd like to do our session. I'm doing it as an experiential education model. So I want to start with a little sample dialogic interpretation through a virtual wildflower prowl. and then step back from that and say, okay, well, what made that flower prowl dialogic interpretation? And then I'll cover very quickly for you some of the key elements that make up dialogic interpretation, and then talk about your next steps as far as how you might then go on and experiment with the ideas. So we'll do this little experience first, then we'll step back and observe it and analyze it. Okay, so I want to take you on a virtual wildflower prowl, which I know fits pretty well with your topic of your sessions, which are virtual mind walks. So we are going to go on an actual walk in our minds, all right? And the reason I've chosen to do wildflowers is that I have always loved flowers. And as a frontline interpreter many years ago, was always my favorite thing, was to lead flower walks for people. So I've taken what I would do face-to-face in an outdoor setting, tried to turn it into a virtual and dialogic prowl for you. So you'll have to play along. You'll have to use your imaginations a bit, but let's get going on it, okay? All righty. So let's assume now that we've all gathered together at the start of the trailhead for our flower walk. So picture that this is what it looks like. I don't know if that's a California poppy there or what, but anyway, so we're all gathered together. I've done the intro to everybody. Welcome to the flower tour. I've asked who you are and where you're from, and we've already done that as a group. So now we're going to start talking about wildflowers though. So I want everybody just to think about an experience you've had with wildflowers, and in one word, how would you describe that experience? And if you're already on Menti, please type it in on Menti, and we'll have it come up on the screen so that we'll be able to see what you typed in. And I'll open up my chat box in case you want to put it in there. Oh, it looks like Nancy. Yeah, Nancy, the slides should be moving for you now. Okay, good. Okay. So what one word comes to mind when you think about an experience you had with wildflowers? And I'll bring up what people are saying. Okay, thank you for participating in the Menti here. I'm seeing words like exciting, beauty, colorful, curiosity, magical. And this is a word cloud, so the more times a word is said, the larger it shows up on our screen. So that means a few of you have said colorful. And Julie has said wonder, a beautiful word. All right, we'll give people just another minute or so to put their ideas in there. And so this is a technique, right? It's one word. What one word would you use to describe your experience with wildflowers? Magical, beauty, hope, curiosity, inspiring. Love it. Okay, so thank you for sharing those thoughts about your experience with flowers. So does anybody want to share why you chose that word? And I know you would have to do it in the chat box because we can't have your microphones on, but anybody in the chat box want to just, whoever's a fast typist, type up, what was it about that experience with wildflowers that made you say that word? And what made it so memorable? And I'm looking in the chat box. I see Sharon's talking about why is it here? When I see wildflowers, they tend to be massed, meaning in big groups, I'm assuming. And if you want to add any thoughts or correct me on my interpretations, please do so in the chat box. So they tend to be massed together, right? Yeah, and that's one of the things that make them so beautiful. First time I saw a passion flower bloom, I thought it was a spaceship. That is so neat, yeah. Yeah, some flowers are pretty otherworldly looking. And so Monica said she chose color because of the super bloom. The super bloom, right. Nice. Makes your heart soar. That's beautiful, thank you. And flowers make me happy, and all the colors, yes. Colors of the rainbow are in there. So you can see that if we were face-to-face, we'd be talking about this, and you wouldn't be forced to say anything, but if you wanted to, you're welcome to share about your wildflower experience, just like you're doing in the chat box. Super, thank you. Let's keep moving here on our walk. Let's get going. The signs of the season changing, I see Sarah Jo has said. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do now, right? We're gonna head out on our walk along the trail. Everybody's got the right footwear and we've got water, etc. So we're taking care of your needs. But here's something to ponder then. As we're prowling for flowers, the flowers are also on the prowl. And so keep that thought in mind as we go. Okay, so why is it that flowers are prowling? Well, I think we all learned this in grade school, right? Flowers are prowling to get their job done, and their job is to get pollen onto the pistil and presto, seeds. Doesn't happen that fast, we know that, but we know it's about getting the male part, the pollen, onto the female part, which is the pistil, and then seeds will be produced. That's why flowers are on the prowl, but how do they prowl? Okay, so let's wander along the trail here. And as we're wandering, I guess there's something just to keep in mind is that that we'll talk about at the very end is that what could we do to help wildflowers be successful at getting their job done? So they're on the prowl to make seeds. What can we do to help them? Keep that in the back of your mind. All right. Oh, and don't forget your flower prowl tools, right? So I always like to give out magnifying glasses. So here you go. Also, nowadays, since we have our camera phones, you can take pictures of close-ups of the flowers. Flashlights, if your eyesight's failing like mine, you might want to use a flashlight on your phone so that you can look closely at the flower parts. And here's some flower guide sheets so that we can identify some of the flowers. And of course, you have to use your imagination as we go. All right, so along the trail we go. Okay, let's stop. We got to stop and look at these beautiful roses. It's Alberta's wildflower, the province that I lived in most of my life. Okay, so throw it out there to you, into the Menti and or the chat box. What tricks do you think roses are using to get their job done? What are they doing? How are they prowling? They're just trying to get pollen onto the pistil to help seeds form, but what are their tricks? And I'll take the picture away in just a second here. I like to enjoy it on the screen for a minute here. Okay, I'm seeing lots of results come into the Menti. You're pretty quick on the Menti, that's awesome. Okay, so we've got color and smell. Of course, that beautiful pink color, the bright color attracts the bees, right? And the smell is from the nectar, right? So the bees are getting a little treat out of it, but the smell lets them know, hey, come on in here. Here's something good for you. Smell attracts them in. They get the nectar as their little treat, so it's a little trade-off. And the smell, yeah. Blooming at certain times of the year, yes. And roses are one of the earlier ones to come out, at least in my part of the world. Their shape attracts insects, yeah. And we'll look at another one in a minute that has another trick up its sleeve as far as its shape. All right, awesome. And the smell, yeah. One of the things about the roses that I like to point out is to show you that the ease of getting at the center there. Someone's just getting at that point of, it's a different looking, right? The center is very different looking than the outside of the flower, which makes it look like a bullseye. So it's kind of like, hey, come in here. This is the bullseye where you need to head to. Okay, super. We'll keep moving because, as you know, the purpose of this really is to look at dialogic interpretation, but we got to have fun using the technique. Okay, so we move along the trail now and we're seeing some fireweed. I'm not sure if you see that in California. You can let me know. But anyway, so what, Menti or in the chat box, what tricks are the fireweed using to get their job done? And we have to stop and enjoy them too. Look at them in that beautiful setting. It could be the same tricks as the rose, could be some different ones. Right, we've got the color, so they're using that pink color that's attracting to bees, definitely. And the height, yes, see, they're nice and tall, right? So they're taking advantage of that height, yes, exactly. And let's see what's showing up in Menti here. We've got the height and the color, yes, the height that it stands out. Their shape and their flower position, yes, and the multiple flowers. So what they're doing is instead of having all their flowers open up at once, they're opening up slowly, right? So they've got the bottom ones are open and then they'll die off and the top ones will come out. And so that's just their way of spreading out the love. Yeah, the size and the shape is attracting the skinny flowers to attract, yes. So flowers are after different pollinators, not always necessarily the bees. So the flower gets a different shape to fit a different pollinator. Yeah, awesome. You got the idea. Beautiful. And someone needs to tell me if you see fireweed down there. I'll move on. Let's move along on the trail. Okay, so now we're seeing some crocus. Now really the crocus is probably not going to be out the same time as the fireweed, so it's virtual, so go with me on this one. So what tricks are the crocus using? What are its ways of making sure it's getting pollinated? Okay, right, being early. Yes, they're the early birds, right? So they're out there before other things like fireweed are out there. The color, yes, and the early bloom. So the first insects are looking for something. And they have long reproductive parts. Yes, you notice how they're sticking way up. So that's to get more notice. But they've also planned it accordingly so that the pollen on the one flower is down low, which means it probably won't self-pollinate. That pollen will get carried off to a different crocus because it wants to spread its genetic diversity. It doesn't want the pollen from that particular bloom to pollinate itself, right? Which some flowers are using that trick. And do crocus have scents? I think they do, yeah. The cupped petals, right? So that's kind of that bowl, right? It's like making a little safe environment for the bugs to come into. And they do also have like a wide center, the color, and kind of little lines, almost like look like runways. And some flowers have more of that, right? Those lines that lead you down into lead the bugs down into the center. Fireweed. Oh, fireweed in MacArthur, Burney Falls. Awesome. Okay. Oh, we've got two more flowers here, and we're going to move quickly through them. What about the daisies? What tricks are they using? How are they making sure to get their job done? Prowling. Let's bring up your thoughts here. Yes, the petals bring the eyes to the center, right? And the center looks like a bullseye, similar to the rose. The eye catching, yes, so the center looks like a target, right? It's a large surface area, right? You know, a lot of flowers are just big and flat. That makes it nice and easy for any pollinator to land, right? And some flowers want certain pollinators and others are just like, yeah, I don't care, just any old bug can land here. So they're flat, making nice and easy. Lots of mini flowers, yes. So the thing about daisies and the other composites, right, is that, and I'm just amazed by this, but they are made up of a whole number of little flowers. So every one of those little white petals is actually its own flower. So somehow in the evolutionary history, these plants figured out if they all clump together, they have a better chance of getting noticed and getting pollinated. Okay, awesome. Thank you for looking at the daisies. Remember, we're using our magnifying glasses and looking really closely at those inner parts. Okay, and our last one, let's not forget about our friends, the grasses. So how are the grasses getting pollinated? How are they getting their job done? They're all after the same thing. They want to get pollinated and get seeds formed. Yes, so they're using the wind, right? So they're pretty, yeah, they're pretty non-specific. They just want the wind, and they grow tall so the wind can blow them around. Yeah, definitely. And if you're like me and allergic to pollen from grasses, you're not that impressed when it comes out. But yes, the long stems, right, getting up where the wind and the animals are, because the animals could help spread the pollen, but the animals could also help spread the seeds after too, right? Yeah, tall to be up there in the breeze. Super. All right, so you got the idea. Lots of fun looking at virtual flowers. So before we move on our trail here, any questions you have about those flowers and how they were prowling? Any thoughts? And this would be a popcorn style where it's just pop with a thought in the chat box if you have one. And if not, we're going to move along on our trail here. Okay, let's move along on our trail, because one of the things that's always great to do when you go for a trail walk is to just stop and take a seat somewhere and reflect. So let's stop and do that and reflect on those flowers we just saw along the trail and how they're getting their job done, the amazing intricacy of their working so that they get pollinated and get the seeds formed. What do you appreciate about them, about flowers and how they get their job done? Any thoughts? So again, now we're just sitting at a beautiful spot. Hopefully we're in a super bloom and we've got lots of flowers around us for inspiration. Use the Menti or the chat box. It's type up your thoughts. What do you appreciate about flowers? Lisa, someone did say, yes, there are some fireweed in California. I forget the name of the place, but it's in the chat box earlier. So in terms of what you appreciate, Julie's saying they're beautiful to look at. They have an interesting place in the ecosystem. Yes, they have a critical place in the ecosystem. Yeah. how pleasing they are so that we're inspired. Yes, that's true. They make sure that they are beautiful, and that helps us help them. Yeah. You're seeing here up on the screen some of the thoughts coming in from the people doing the Menti pools. How much richer we are to have the different kinds. Yes, the variety, the smells. If you think about flowers and how important they are to humans, I mean, we've had a relationship with flowers forever. Bring importance to living things. Yeah, so amazing, right? How many ways they have to prowl. Yes, I'm amazed by that, as you can tell. I'm always looking at what they're up to, what are the inner workings and how are they getting that job done? Awesome. Okay, well, the interest of time, we're going to leave our little reflection spot. I know you don't want to, but let's move on. So now we're towards the end of the walk, right? We're coming full circle. And I just want to do again, let's say we're all gathered in a circle. What can we do to help wildflowers? As I mentioned earlier, how can we help them be successful at prowling, at getting their seeds produced? So this is your chance just to say any and all ideas you have for what we can do. How can we help wildflowers? And again, type them in the chat box or Menti. We'll give everybody a minute to do that. So you're seeing what's showing up in the chat box here about protecting habitat, and that's why we had parks and protected areas, protecting them from damage by staying on the trails. I figure that's what you mean. Trying to get rid of invasive species, leave them alone, let them do their thing, not picking them. Yes, yeah. Taking care of the pollinators, right? The bees and animals that the flowers are depending on. It's a two-way street, right? Both are depending. Plant native flowers, yes, and that's a really good point. So if you're going to plant flowers, as much as you can, you're going to plant native ones to avoid, well, at least to avoid spreading invasive species. Yes, definitely. Learn how they fit in your life and what they mean to you. Yeah, even just thinking about it, I find, is a useful thing to do. Okay, and our last thing to talk about while we're on our flower walk is this. You've seen all those different ideas for what things we can do, any and all of us. Now's your chance to also just say, what one thing are you going to do? Well, this is your chance to make a little commitment to yourself. And always optional. You don't have to participate in the Menti or the chat box. That's up to you. And if we were face to face, it'd be the same thing. You wouldn't have to participate with your one thing. But if you want to, it's your chance to say, okay, what's your one thing that you're going to do? So for me, I mentioned earlier, it's just learning more about these flowers that are all new to me out here. And if I'm going to plant any in my yard, I'm going to try to make sure that they're native, that they're good ones for the pollinators, definitely to give the pollinators a break too. So yeah, we've got Marlon saying plant some in the gardens. And support organizations that are protecting wildflower habitats. Yeah, thank you. And let me just open up the Menti here so we can see what people have put in there. There we go. So plant more natives, educate people, plant some in my yard, not using pesticides, yeah, or using natural pesticides if you can, educate, right? Thank you for thinking about what one thing you can do and making a little commitment by typing it up here. Okay, well, that brings us full circle at the end of our virtual wildflower tour. I hope you enjoyed it. We stopped and looked at flowers and smelled them, and we talked about what tricks they're up to and what you can do to help. Now let's just do a debrief of that as an interpretive event that's meant to be an example of dialogic interpretation. Okay, so here's the definition I use for dialogic interpretation. It's a visitor-centered participatory approach that invites visitors to engage in two-way or multi-way conversations. It's based on either the visitors' questions or the questions that are carefully planned and asked by the interpreters, with the goal of learning for all, inspiring visitors to connect to places. I say places plus because I want to get at the idea that it could be something in particular, in this case, wildflowers that we're connecting to, not necessarily a specific place, but in ways that are meaningful, right, to our visitors, and that leads to some kind of action. Right, either at the site, like going to look at more flowers, or afterwards, something in your gardens, or to just a change in being, right? Just viewing the world a little bit differently, I guess. Okay, so given that that's, I believe, a pretty good definition of what dialogic interpretation is, and you've just gone on what I believe was a dialogic interpretation wildflower walk, what do you think made that wildflower prowl dialogic interpretation? And same thing, in the Menti or the chat box, please throw your thoughts out there. What made our little wildflower prowl dialogic interpretation? I'm seeing the idea of questions, right? And inviting people to participate together. Discussion between the leader / teacher and the participants, yes. And again, face-to-face, we could have even more of that going on. So you learn new information. Yes, information is an important part of any kind of interpretation. The questions asked what we saw as we were observing, right? So the questions were actually meant to guide, but not to be right or wrong type questions, right? Like I wasn't specifically asking you to tell me something that had an exact right or wrong answer. It was more about your feelings and thoughts and experiences. Inviting critical thinking, hope so. Open-ended questions, right, that were not just information, but information did get covered, okay? I think that's critical. Questions as we observed, right? Adding everyone's thoughts, yes, and Menti's great for that because you can see them all. Provoke thoughts about our own experiences, right? And then because we're virtual, of course, it's nice to have that way to type them, put them up on the screen. If we were face-to-face, we could be actually just talking. Super. Okay, and we'll kind of tease it apart as we go through the next half hour as well. All righty. So why do we encourage dialogic interpretation? Why do we use it? Here's 3 different perspectives. Carol Blaney did her master's thesis on the U.S. National Park Service, some parks she studied, and this was her suggestion in the end, was that engaging in dialogue could better participants' lives, contribute to solving tough problems, make civic institutions more relevant and useful. Brian Forrest did his PhD on two-way interpretation or two-way communications, also in the National Park Service. And what he found was that sometimes afterwards people had forgotten who the interpreter was, but they hadn't forgotten about the experience that they had. And he felt that that was a good benefit of dialogic two-way communications because people were remembering more about their own lived experience and not maybe necessarily the interpreter as much. And then the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is an international group who've been doing dialogic interpretation for some 20 years at sites of conscience, so at various sites that are related to issues that might be considered controversial, right? So they put out these tools they call front page dialogues, and I encourage you to check out their website. These are questions that you might ask if you were running a dialogic interp program on a certain controversial topic, that some of the questions that you might want to use to be able to get into some deeper conversation with people. Okay, so here's what I believe are the key elements of dialogic interpretation or dialogic guiding. 6 of them. So one is content or information. We've already talked about that. In the flower walk, I tried to fit in content and information in and around your contributions, right? So that was you contributed information and I did as well. So information is covered. There's always still information in dialogic interpretation. Then talk types, different ways of engaging with people at different levels, and the different techniques that you might use, the way the questions are formed, and then this whole idea of inspiring people, and then the need for a growth mindset. I'm going to go through each of those last 5 right now, just very briefly. We won't go through content or information anymore because I think we acknowledged that we did cover content in the flower walk, maybe just in a different way. So the idea of the talk type mountain came about with me working with my staff over the years on how we would engage with visitors in more dialogic interpretation. And some of the other models that were out there were not working for our group. And of course, we were working in the mountain park, so a mountain seemed like a suitable metaphor. So the whole idea here, though, is that you're not going to try to jump into talking with people about a deep, controversial subject right off the bat. That's the deep talk. You want to kind of work your way to that. So you work your way to that by having small talk with people. So in the case of our flower walk, we started with, hello, my name is, where you're from, and what's one word to describe? Would you like to share why that flower experience was relevant to you? Small talk is easy, no right or wrong. It's kind of casual. Let's make it comfortable to dialogue. Then as you work your way up the talk type mountain, you get more into the talk that's around the actual activities. So in the case of our flower walk, we were looking at flowers, we were looking at them with magnifying glasses, we were talking about the tricks of the trade that they were using. So we had an activity, which was very clearly to be looking closely at flowers, and the talk happened in and around that activity. Usually that's the easiest one to facilitate because people are busy doing the activity and talking about it, right? And then as you work your way up the mountain, you want to get into the more deep talk as people are more comfortable. In the case of our walk, we didn't get to deep talk until the end, which was more of the, well, what can we do to help flowers and what will you do? And so that was our deep talk portion. It was pretty short, but it was meant to be, okay, now we've had this experience and we're feeling comfortable together. Hey, what things can we do in this case to help wildflowers? So it's important, I think, to consider working people sort of up that talk type mountain. An example that we had created in Banff National Park, it was called the Game of Homes, which of course was a ripoff of Game of Thrones. It did win a gold award, and so I like to share it with people, and the link is there to go on and watch it. It's an hour-long program, so there was plenty of time in there to get to deep talk. And it's really, I guess, the reason it's a good example, I think, that I like to share with people is because the whole program was planned with this idea of dialogic interpretation in mind. So we talked about how do we make a program that has small talk, activity talk, and deep talk. In the case of this program, this is pre-COVID, that's why there's no masks. People get together in small groups as a small talk just to introduce themselves and to come up with a name for their bear den, because they've been broken into 3 groups, 3 different bear dens, and they're going to compete for the Game of Homes. And so easy, right? They have to come up with a name for their group, gets them going, comfortable. Then they get together with their group after to do some activities after the information has been shared. So the interpreter has shared bear stories about these 3 bears, right? So people are getting that information, and now in their groups are going, okay, well, how do we create a banner or a symbol like they might have in Game of Thrones that best represents our bear? So they're taking the information that the interpreter has shared and they're making it meaningful to them by creating this banner. And then there's some more activities and the program goes on. And then the very end part is the deep talk, which is, okay, well, what kinds of things can we do to help bears? Like by keeping the distance when we see them not getting out of our cars or approaching them, that sort of thing. So they're having deep talk around the topic of bears and bear conservation. And they're being given, as they make a commitment, they're being given a little card, a little piece of swag, which is a little collector card. That's the social marketing element, which is saying, if you make a commitment to stay in your car next time you see bears, here's your little reward. So the deep talk, you build up to that, and by then people are comfortable saying, well, sure, I commit to staying in my vehicle when I see a bear. So it's just a great example, I think, of the idea of taking people through those talk types. Another key element for dialogic interpretation is the facilitation techniques. And that's the kind of thing where we do an activity of some sort that makes the dialogue feel comfortable and easy. It's not just getting in a circle all the time and saying, who wants to share? Even that, we try to avoid. You're trying to make things feel comfortable. So we did in the flower walk, we did 1 word. Nice and easy approach, right? Most people can come up with 1 word right at the beginning, and that's relatively easy. So 1 word. Sometimes it's hard keeping people down to 1 word. So 1 word activity technique to use to get conversation started. Another one in the purple there, I've highlighted the ones that I've used with you today, is popcorn. And that's just that idea of who would like to pop with an answer. Popping is always optional. So that's just that typical who would like to speak up and say something, not forcing anyone. Carpet of ideas. When you do a face-to-face, you're getting people to write thoughts on a piece of paper and set it down on the ground, and you sort of stand in a circle around and you stare down at the pieces of paper and you use those carpet of ideas to dialogue on the topic. Nobody has to acknowledge which their idea was, so it's anonymous. We kind of did carpet of ideas when you type things up in Menti up on the screen, right? You had your thoughts there, Nobody knew whose thoughts they were. It could become food for thought and discussion. Reflection time in the flower walk, we took that time. Often it's needed before dialogue because a lot of times people need some time to reflect before they're ready to answer a question, right? So try to build that in. The within and between cohorts, we weren't able to do that too much on the virtual walk today. When I do this and I can have people in breakout groups, then I do that. So the idea there is that people will talk more readily within the cohort, so the group they came with. And especially during COVID, this is a really good technique to consider, that you may not be able to get between cohort conversations, right, with different groups talking to each other, but at the very least, you can get the group of people that came together doing some talking and dialogue within that little group and giving them that time and the invitation to do so. You know what, you do that afterwards, they're going to talk about it more later, they're going to share more about it because they've had that opportunity to do some talking within the cohort. So again, that's a really important technique in Dialogic Interp, is to get people talking within the cohort, and if you can, have them join up with another cohort, and then you get that magic in the middle, right, as far as the different groups sharing thoughts and ideas with each other. Graffiti wall, I didn't actually include this in the flower walk, but you know, when I said, well, what things could we do to help flowers? So if we were at a building and we had the capacity, I could give you like a sticky note and say, okay, what one thing can we do to help flowers? And you'd write it out and you put that up on our wall, on our bulletin board or whatever. And that would be our graffiti wall, meaning other people can come by and see it and get prompted to add their own or to think about what they can do on their own. So the gallery tour is that idea of going around and looking at what other people have produced in whatever format that might be. And it's different for every case. In this case, it could be about flowers. And then I might say to you at the very end, when I asked you what one thing would you commit to doing to help flowers out, I'll give you, a suitably shaped flower sticky note where you could write your own thing down and then take that away with you, right? That's your reminder of what action you've said you'll do. So lots of different facilitation techniques out there. In the United States National Park Service, which I'm always looking at their resources, they have lots of good stuff there. They are calling what I call dialogic and participatory interpretation, they call ACE, which stands for Audience-Centered Experiences. And there is a YouTube channel where there's ACE videos of some of their rangers have created and put up there. This one was a program on owls. And after talking about owls and their different adaptations, this interpreter is using the voting technique, which is a really popular one in dialogic interpretation, is just to get people to vote on something. It doesn't matter what it is, something relevant to your topic. In this case, she's saying, come and stand by one of these 4 white squares that represent owl adaptations that you most would like to have yourself. So would you like to have good hearing or good eyesight or be a silent flyer? So stand next to the square by voting for which adaptation you would most like to have. And then you can have the talking within the cohort. Now your cohort is the people who also would like to have really good eyesight. So you vote and then you get that chance to chat a little bit in small groups around however you voted. So quite a popular technique in dialogic interpretation. Another key element of dialogic interpretation is the idea of questions. And I break questions down into small talk, activity talk, and deep talk. So here's some examples of the small talk questions that you might get people talking about right at the beginning. In a bear program, for instance, we get people turning to the people around them and let them know what wildlife you've seen so far, right? It gives them that commonality to talk about right at the beginning. And what we find when we start our programs where we invite people to share with the people around them something, whatever the topic is, that oftentimes it's hard to get them to stop that talking to move on with the program because they're so engaged in sharing ideas with each other, which is actually awesome. But it also means that a lot of times at the end of the program, people have made new friends and now they stay and they chat and share stories with each other at the end of the program. Right? So to me, that's got a huge value, just that in itself. So small talk questions, you notice that none of these are like right or wrong, right? They're more getting people engaged in conversation and getting them started. The activity talk questions, you'll see how these have a little bit of an activity slant to them. So let's get everyone lining up here, a voting activity based on how important to history you think David Thompson is. Assumes you know who David Thompson is. So if you've come to this National Historic Site, you've already been told who David Thompson is. But how important was he? That's what you're being asked to vote on. Right? So the voting is the activity. one activity has people drawing or writing about injustice. So again, no right or wrong answers, no yes or no type questions, but getting at the actual activity. And then when you get to deep talk, this is your question. These are your questions that are going to be a little more in depth. They're going to be at getting at more of a possibly controversial topic, or what actions you might take after. What are you taking home that's a new thought or something shocking? You've just visited the site. How have your impressions changed? What are you inspired to do after? So these are the ones that you would ask more towards the end, say of a walk or of a tour around a facility. And of course, the questions all have to fit together, right? They still have to have, you still have to have an overall topic and the information that fits. Another element of dialogic interpretation, and all interpretation, I believe, is this idea of the call to action. We're trying to inspire people to something. So we're trying to inspire them to take action at the site. In the case of our flower tour, for instance, it would be, let's go and look for more flowers and let's not trample on them or pick them. Like those are actions that we're inspiring people to take while they're there. Actions after they leave the site, that could be the ones we talked about, which is to plant wildflowers and to help pollinators. And again, you notice what we did there in that wildflower walk was that I asked you for your ideas of things you could do, and then I asked you to commit to your own. I didn't tell you that I think you should do this, right? It wasn't a preachy, I think you should do. It's leaving it to people to come up with their own ideas. Generally, people know the right things to do, the things that are going to be beneficial. You don't need me to list them for you, right? So I think it's in a dialogic interp format, you would be getting people bringing those up for themselves and then committing to doing one. And then there's that idea of non-action, right? That we're not always inspiring people to action, that sometimes it's just to a change in being and or to an understanding. And so I think that's a given that we're aiming for that in all interpretation. And here's a couple of examples of actions that people might be inspired to. The picture on the left there is a Parks Canada program on bats as a species at risk. And so the whole program has been participatory and dialogic and lots of fun. And now at the very end, they've come up to the interpreter with their certificate to get it stamped. And before they get the stamp, which is a cute bat symbol, they have to say what it is they're going to do to help bats. And I have seen adults who didn't have any kids with them at all hold up their certificate and line up in the lineup to give their commitment to the interpreter to get the stamp on their certificate. I thought that was wonderful. The one on the right is a little viewing card, actually ends up being about the size of a credit card. It's based on a tool we used in the mountain parks in Canada, and the Whooping Crane organization in Indiana decided to use it. Essentially, it becomes a square you fold in half. Those little white rectangles are cut out, and you hold it at arm's length so that when you look through the little white rectangle, the wildlife, in this case the crane, really only just fills up that space. So it's really getting at, if the whooping crane is filling up that entire rectangle, you're too close. So it just becomes that little prompt for taking an action, which is to keep your distance from the whooping cranes. I look forward to hearing from that group as to how it worked. We've been using the one in Banff for viewing of bears and giving them out to people for the last few years. And people seem to like them. It's that little prompt, that little takeaway that helps encourage action. And the last element that I believe is critical to dialogic interpretation is the idea of having a growth mindset. And growth mindset and fixed mindset are studied by Carol Dweck from Stanford. And so if you Google growth mindset and Carol Dweck, there's lots of YouTube videos, et cetera, and TED Talks by her. But the general idea and why it fits with dialogic interpretation is this idea that in a growth mindset, we believe that all of our interpreters, staff or volunteers, whatnot, can learn and grow, that we can always get better, right? That whatever we're focused on can always get better. And in terms of dialogic interpretation, it's that idea that, you know what, we're probably already having good conversations with our visitors, but can we get better at it? And can it be more audience-centered and more two-way? Probably, right? So it's that idea that we can always improve, that our effort will help. And then the challenges is a big one. It's this idea, of course, with COVID as an example. It's like, how do we see COVID? Do we see it as something that's a threat that we're going to back down from? Well, no. In interpretation, we know interpreters have just grabbed onto different ways of working, doing our jobs, like virtual mind walks. so that the challenge is framed and seen as an opportunity for growth. And as you know, you probably reach new audiences through different techniques, and so turning that threat into an opportunity. Looking at mistakes, that same thing, right? Like it's not a mistake, it's just a learning opportunity. And then the last one's a really important one that really worked well with my staff, which was this idea of everybody giving feedback. In fact, we call it feed forward, right? Because it's always geared towards let's figure out how you can get better. And people started really asking for it. Instead of it being seen as something to take defensively and take personally, it became you know what, I want you to tell me, what did you think of those questions I asked on that program, and how might I ask it differently next time? So in fact, we started introducing growth mindset and dialogic interpretation at the same time. And my interpreter said to me, Jacquie, they have to go hand in hand. Because if you want interpreters to be offering dialogic interp, they have to be open to growing and learning. And that makes it exciting, especially for older and returning interpreters. It's new opportunities. So I always put this slide in here to remind me to tell you that we can use dialogic interpretation in non-personal media as well. And here's an example in the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And at the very top of the top floor, after people have gone through all the exhibits, there's this invitation to share your thoughts about human rights. So this is one of those graffiti walls. People have got the little cards and they put their own thoughts on. They put them up there or take them home if they want, but they put them there. Other people see them and it prompts other people to leave their own thoughts and to maybe talk within their group and to engage in conversation around this particular topic, which is what the museum is all about. And then speaking of museums, you know, the dialogic interp principles are equally as useful and valuable in a museum and or cultural heritage setting as they are in natural heritage. I use a flower walk, which is a natural history topic, mostly because of my love for flowers. But certainly all these principles work with museums, and I've worked with museum groups on developing dialogic interpretation that uses all these same principles. So in terms of a summary from my end, I want to say that, you know, when I look at dialogic interpretation, I think of it as it's audience-centered, right? It's all about talking with the audience back and forth and not so much a one-way transfer of information from the interpreter out. Learning for all, as I mentioned with that growth mindset idea, that it's participatory, right? You're engaging people in these activities, even if it is just an activity of saying what one word comes to mind. Inspirational, I like to think it is, in the sense that it fits with what I studied as inspiration, and the idea that people are inspired by something and to something, and that leads to this action after. Fun, because it's engaging and two-way, and or it could be multi-way, and that gets at the idea of not just the interpreter and one visitor talking, but getting visitors talking amongst the group that they came with, and or that between cohort where you get that potential magic in the middle of ideas being shared by each other, being facilitated, you know, by the interpreter. And I guess I look at it as no matter what, we can always get better at the questions we ask our visitors and the kind of conversations we have with them. And that to me is what the basics of what dialogic interpretation is all about. So I'll turn it back to you. You haven't done anything on Menti in a couple of minutes, and I know we have just a few minutes left. So all that quick sampler introduction to dialogic interpretation, here's your chance now to share anything you think about how you might be able to use it. Any one thing, and it's all really about baby steps, because you're probably already using some of these principles anyway, but is there one thing that jumps out at you that you were like, oh, I want to go try that? And we'll just give you a chance to do that. And nobody's going to follow up with you. It's more for your own sake. While you're thinking about the topic, does it help you to put something down as a bit of a commitment to yourself? Right, so it sounds like someone wants to use the all talk types idea, right, of gearing or going from small talk through activity talk to deep talk, that when you're leading tours, certainly, and the longer you have with people, of course, the more dialogic you can get. My interpreters, you know, they always commented it was a little hard to get to deep talk in a 5-minute conversation with people. And I say, well, yeah, I understand that. So if you have small talk and a little activity talk and you leave them with some action to do, that's great. You know, that's still better. And framing the questions prior, yes. Yes, it really comes down to questions and trying them out and testing them, retrying, modifying, having a bunch of what I call back pocket questions, right? And a little index card in your back pocket. And okay, so someone in the chat box is commenting on viewing of the questions from sort of common to activity to more deep. Sometimes people want to talk deep talk right away, okay, and that's fine. You jump into it if that's what they want to do, right? But not necessarily everybody wants to do that. And the participatory, right, with the visitors. Yeah, I'm a big advocate for as hands-on and participatory as we can make interpretation, whether that means dialogue or just having more hands-on things to do. Super. Thank you for sharing your ideas. I didn't mention earlier, but I will share all of the Menti slides, which means my information slides plus these ones where your thoughts are there. That all get saved at the end. And I will share that with Mariana or Monica, and they'll be able to get it to you. Assuming they have your contact info, they'll be able to get it to you. So you'll have all of the ideas, mine plus the ones that the group came up with. And that's awesome. I think it's crowdsourcing, I think, in our field is amazing. We can always learn from each other. Okay, so I want to tell you really briefly about some of my trainings that I do in dialogic interpretation, and I'll give you my web link at the end. I think I have. Anyway, I'll make sure that Mariana or Monica have it. But I do Dialogic Interpret the Basics, which is a 3-hour course. So it goes into more depth than we're able to right now in this 1 hour. Same idea, same topics, but we've got 3 hours instead of 1. And that's one that I encourage for a place to sign their staff up for if they really just want, 3 hours worth of training. People have the ideas and then they can go away and try things out. Then I have Beyond the Basics, which is 7 hours. And so we do it over 2 days. And so that is literally like it says, we get into each of the modules on the basics, the talk types, facilitation techniques, etc., including overcoming of obstacles. And at the end of each module, we built in time for people to reflect on how that module relates directly to their work. So there's enough time to be able to do that and to have that crowdsourcing and feed forward back and forth. And then people who do that course and who want to then develop their own specific program that uses the Dialogic Interpret principles, that's what this Making It Real course is all about. So that's when I mostly do custom, because I get a group who says, well, we want to work as a group on developing an interp program that uses all these principles. So we work together and we use the modules as information and content, and then we actually develop a program for the site, whatever that might be. That's always lots of fun because you get different ideas from different people and crowdsourcing as well. Then I've got a few other ones that are more short, like 2-hour-long trainings. And they're 50, these ones are 50 Canadian, which for you Americans is like practically like $10 or something, I think, so cheap. Anyway, so these are just different ones on facilitating dialogue more during COVID, climbing the participatory ladder. That's one where we get into 10 different ways of getting people to participate, like demonstrations, experiments, costumes and props where the visitors get to use the costumes and the props, activity stations, rotating stations. Anyway, lots of things that I cover in my book as far as hands-on and participatory approaches to interpretation. And then the idea of inspiring action through social marketing. When I talk about giving out little cards to people or little prompts or getting people to make a commitment to something, that's all using the social marketing principles. And next steps, I would just say for you is one thing, if you want more resources, there's the link to my Padlet, which I've just discovered recently. And I've just put all of the resources I have, the various videos and the various things that I've come up with over the last year or so or two related to dialogic interpretation and participatory interpretation, and they're just there. So then you can click on the links and find them. So it's a nice repository of thoughts and ideas. You're welcome to just go and have a look at those. And of course, I hope you want to check out my book. And the key for you, I think, is just to get out there and experiment and have fun with it and share within your group or outside your group, whatever works. It's this idea of the growth mindset and learning and growing. And even if all you do is change one thing, change one set of questions that you ask people on a tour, that's great, right? That's worth celebrating. That's a step towards overall just having better dialogue and conversations with our visitors.